absolutely delighted to be here in my living room, talking to dear Janie Brown, who's there in Vancouver. Janie Brown's wonderful book, Radical Acts of Love, is just out now. It's an extraordinary read. Janie took 8 years to write the book, and it came from 30 years of experience as an oncology nurse and a counsellor. The book is full of wisdom, it's full of insight, it's full of humour. It's paradoxically, for a book that tells 20 different stories of 20 very different approaches to how to approach death, it's paradoxically an inspiring and uplifting book, and it fills us with a kind of extraordinary hope by the time we've finished it. That is something, and I'll be talking to Janie about in a minute, how she actually managed to achieve that effect of giving us hope. But it also seems very, very timely in a way that Janie herself could have not predicted, because now more than ever, we need to have different ways of approaching death. We need to meet it head on in these times. And strangely, despite the numbers that we're hearing during the COVID crisis around the world, we're not really getting people still talking in an intimate way about death. And this is despite the fact that there's been, just in the UK alone, over 31,000 funerals happen in the last few weeks, and the figures around the world are horrifying. So it seems to me an extraordinary book, Janie, in all sorts of different ways, but also an extraordinary time to have published this book. How do you feel about that?
Thanks for the beautiful introduction, Jackie. And we'll maybe speak a little bit about our friendship that started 40 years ago when we were in university, different universities together. But it's just a great honor to be here with you and to be in conversation with you, with people that we can't see, but we know and assume are listening. So thanks for the intro. The book seems to have come at, yes, I mean, who would have known? I wrote a blog recently, said, note to self, don't try and publish a book during a pandemic, because honestly, it's quite a time. But I think there's some wisdom to that. This book has appeared on no, I was going to say on the bookshelves, but not really, because the bookshops are closed. But it's a book that seems to me speaking to this imperative that I think is even more so now that, you know, I think of mortality has stepped into our living rooms with all of us, and really come closer than we tend to put death in terms of our relationship to it. We often wait till we're ill or till we're elderly, and then we let it in closer, and then we have to figure out, am I going to talk about it with my family, or am I going to even acknowledge to myself that death is imminent, or death will come, you know, for all of us. So it seems imperative now that we are, you know, we've entered into these conversations or not right now. And of course, the conversations are different, aren't they? Because of, you know, this virus that's upon us. And yet my world, I work with so many people who are living with cancer, is deeply affected in this time as well. People at the end of life who are dying of other things. You know, there's huge changes that have come. So we'll talk maybe more about that, but I'm really delighted to bring the book into this conversation.
I'm delighted as well to be here. And, you know, yeah, it seems both a lifetime away when we were hanging out in Rankeeler Street in Edinburgh and in Stirling, you know, when I was 18 and you were 18 or 19. It seems a lifetime ago to being here now. In fact, it is. It's like, as you say, it's 40 years. And one of the things that's fascinating about, oops, sorry, I think I've just lost my earpiece. Can you still hear me though?
Yes. Yeah.
You can. One of the things that's strange about death itself is that it makes you look at a life in all of its, not just in terms of time, but in terms of the things that have mattered during that life. People can live very, very worthwhile lives and die very young, and you're still having to look at what their life has been like. And one of the most extraordinary things about your book is that it takes people at all different ages, and you find yourself being kind of blown away and in awe of particularly the young people who are having to find ways to talk to young daughter, Daniel, finding ways to talk to his young daughter about grief. But that reminded me of your very brilliant opening to this book, where you talk about your first encounter with death. And I wonder if you could just read us a little bit of that for now, please.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I thought I'd read just a couple of pages from the very beginning, which is actually the preface, which sets up the book. And as Jackie said, the book is 20 stories, and this is really the intro to those 20 stories. So I'll read this, and it's about 2 or 3 minutes. Gran was the first person I saw die. I was 19 years old and she was 81. She was my father's mother, and she lived with our family for the last couple of years of her life in a small cottage attached to the old sandstone house my 3 siblings and I were raised in, just outside Glasgow. Gran died of esophageal cancer, more common in those days because of the heavy cigarette smoking combined with her daily tipples of whiskey. I remember following Mum into Gran's bright white bedroom and watching over her shoulder as she washed my grandmother and changed the soiled sheets. I wanted to help her care for Gran, but I felt frozen, unsure what to do, even though I had worked in hospitals for 2 summers by then. Gran was my kin, not a patient. That made a difference then. I don't remember being afraid of death, rather just curious about the unusual smells in the room and the fact that she coughed a lot and didn't talk much. Mum made it okay. She didn't seem afraid either, just busy. She had been a nurse too, which must have helped her know what to do. There were no long, heartfelt conversations at Gran's bedside, nor long bucket lists of activities to be accomplished. There was just the work of dying, for my Gran, the patient, and for my mum, the caregiver. I learned then that most deaths are natural, not easy, but not necessarily scary, nor traumatic or over-medicalized, not romantic nor glorified. Death is most often ordinary and manageable, acceptable, but deeply sad. The majority of old people like my grandmother died at home in those days before it was commonplace to be admitted to a hospital or hospice for the last days or weeks of life. Most people now under 60 have never seen a person die, so have become deeply fearful about death, both their own and the deaths of their beloved others. They have had no role models to show them how to care for a dying person, and therefore no confidence in being able to do so. My hope is that the baby boomer cohort, who pushed for the return of the midwives to demedicalize birth, will also be instrumental in reclaiming the death process. This book is my contribution to the re-empowering of all of us to take charge of our lives and our deaths, remembering that we know how to die, just as we knew how to come into this world. We also know how to heal and to settle our lives as best we can before we die. In my view, this is the greatest gift we could give our loved ones, to be prepared and open and accepting when the time comes for us to leave this world.
I had unmuted myself there, just in case any little rustling that I did hear. But that's an extraordinary passage, and that's the preface to the book. And we go in after that to Karen's story, which is the story of a very, very dear friend of yours, and it begins in quite a shocking way. It's quite a shocking start to the book, that you just get this phone call, and then you're really on a roller coaster, because there's not really been time for her to confront death or to prepare for death. And yet it's the most extraordinary chapter. And actually, for anybody out there, this book is absolutely beautifully written, because you capture the character, the speech patterns, the rhythms, the personality of each of these 20 people, and your writing slightly adjusts to their voices in a sense. So you get a real sense of their voices with your own, which is a kind of an act of some magic in the book. How did you find starting off with writing about Karen? How did you find writing that chapter?
I think that chapter in a way spoke to this, what I just spoke of in the preface about sort of an empowerment that I felt, even though I'd worked in oncology for a lot of years. When I went up to stay with them, they live about 6 hours north of here, kind of packed my bags and went up and thought I'd stay for the duration, because it became clear very quickly she was going to die quite quickly over a number of days, and ended up being a couple of weeks after I got there. So but the feeling I had going through that with them as a couple, and then the feeling I had when I left of being able to be there for them in the particular way that we were, with support from nurses and the healthcare teams and a physician as well, I left thinking we can all do this if it's an uncomplicated death. She was pretty accepting. She was 62. She felt she'd had an amazing life, and she was sad to leave, but she was curious about death. And so I left that feeling sort of an unusually strong commitment in a way to, we can do this. We can learn how to do this. It's not difficult. In fact, it's an honor. It was a sacred time. It was difficult. It was, you know, all the ways death are. It's not clean and tidy, but it can be a beautiful and sacred time. And so I left that thinking, you know, this would be a good start to the book, because it's really saying, you know, we can take care of our loved ones if people can show us and tell us how to do that. And we could do so, I think, with a great amount of dignity and respect for the particular way that person wants to do it, which is, I think, what you were describing. You know, there's so many different ways. There's not one right way to do that.
And so many people die somehow in the manner of their personality in some ways or another, that their own personality will reflect the manner in which they die, sometimes in a way that couldn't have been anticipated, particularly if it's a shocking or a sudden death or a completely unexpected death. But the idea of being present with I've been present at two different people's deaths and or near deaths, and you know, like an hour before they died, and that sense of it being a great sort of privilege to be in the room where the passing is about to take place is something that stays with you forever, and something that people are fearful about. But when you actually experience it, even when somebody is being taken away way before their time, it is one of the few things that can offer you comfort, alongside being able to plan a kind of a funeral or a memorial service. It feels like it's in tune with that person's personality too. It feels like one of those great gifts that you're also giving back, but also taking. And so it interests me that there is so much fear around grief and bereavement and dying. And what do you, I mean, you explore that in all sorts of different ways in these stories, but perhaps you could just talk a little bit generally for people that don't know the individual 20 stories about your thoughts on fear and on grief.
Well, it's basically fear and grief are central to every life. So, you know, we've got lots of practice. What's happening now in the world, of course, is giving us a huge, you know, training ground for understanding our own relationship to fear and grief, even more than perhaps some of us have experienced ever in our life. So, you know, it's again, a human response. Fear is a human response to a threat, and grief is a human response to a loss. So again, we're in this deeply human life, and we really have to figure out how to do that for ourselves. I mean, we really have to understand what we're afraid of. I often think when people say, you know, I'm terrified of dying, and the question is then, what is it specifically you're frightened of? Because fear is like this amorphous mass that kind of lives in us, and it feels like it's just going to take us over and, you know, snatch us up. And people think of death as a grim reaper, you know, that's going to come and get us outside of ourselves, right? So I think seems important for us to understand what's my particular relationship to fear. So being a Scot, I'm a fighter. So fighting comes more naturally to me than running away from things, right? So again, our relationship to death too, like are we open, curious? Do we want to face, do we want to fight? I meet so many people with cancer who say, I'm not, I'm having no truck with death. And there's a fighting instinct. Other people feel, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to even believe, even with this pandemic, I don't really want to believe this is happening. So we have this reaction of fight or run away, the fleeing response. And do we do that in our lives? Do we run away from difficult things? There's no judgment about that. It's just our instinct. Or do we maybe sometimes fight, sometimes run away? Or some people freeze with fear. They just go into a neutral space where they don't really feel very much. They just feel frozen. And, I see that too in this pandemic. People are walking around, certainly felt it myself, a bit of a zombie, like, oh, I feel. And then there's the fourth one in terms of fear is adaptation, which is, of course, such a brilliant human instinct to adapt. And so I see that in death. People are adapting to this reality. This death is upon me, and I'm going to see if I can stand up in it. And I do that not just for my own death, but for my family, my loved ones, so that it makes a difference in this grief afterwards. So I see the distress of, where people aren't able to stand up, and not everyone can, that then there's a lot left for the grieving ones that wish they had conversations, or, they live with regret. And I often think, being courageous in our conversations, if we can be, we need help sometimes. It prevents regret. It, as you said, you live after with the memory of that death being open and loving, hopefully, and caring, and that helps us for the rest of our lives. I mean, these moments are pivotal. Yeah.
I mean, fear is an anticipation of the future, and actually, what we have when we have our lives is we have our past, and we have our present, and and in the moment of the present, people often don't take the opportunity to be wholly present when they're even at somebody's bedside. When they're dying, they might be busy going on their phone or being distracted in one way or another. But actually, if they can take the moment to be properly present, there will be all sorts of unexpected things in that moment. And my dad died, as you know, 6 months ago. And the last time that I visited him, he was very poorly, and he had his oxygen mask on and everything. But my friend Nick had sent a message, who was very close to my dad, and sent a message saying, remind him of the time that we drove to Achmelvit, and he quoted the poem by Norman McCaig, who owns this landscape, and does it have anything to do with love? And so I said this to my dad, and he was really kind of quite out of it by then, so I didn't even know if it would go through, but I thought I'll take the risk and I'll say it. And he took off his oxygen mask, and Nick had quoted about 4 lines of this Norman McCaig poem, and he took off his mask and he said, Nick's being over generous, I only remember 2 lines of that poem. and I was just amazed that he was kind of alert enough to make a joke, and also we had that landscape brought to us. So I was in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. I was simultaneously driving through McCaig's landscape, driving through the Highlands, and these 2 times existed simultaneously. And it seems to me that one of the ways perhaps of dealing with grief is to find that you're dealing with a duality. You're dealing with simultaneous time, because grief keeps a different clock, and 6 months is no time at all, I know. And all you have to do when somebody dies, it's very close to you, is to try and find a way of still living alongside them as the different clock that grief keeps ticks and talks. And so I'm just wondering what you think about that idea and the notion of time. And I remember right at the end of the chapter about Karen, she has this, you see this little glimpse on her face just as she's about to die, and she's got almost a kind of smile on her face, as if she's saying, oh, this is what it's going to be like. And it's quite a shocking sentence, because you're not really expecting that you would notice that, and yet probably she was thinking something like that.
Well, it's such a, I mean, you're just bringing your dad into this, Jackie, and, you know, it takes me to my dad, and I think our mums are probably listening to this conversation that we're having. And, you know, that, you know, once you know someone you love is going to die, the grief is immediate because you're anticipating the end. And I think your beautiful description of how to stay present, you know, and how to do that when it's a busy time, and you know, the grief comes in and out, doesn't it? Like it's the grief before the person dies. And I remember with my dad too, there were the way that we kind of all landed there, and it was like, it was a kind of timeless space, which I think is what makes it, I mean, the word sacred is an interesting one that a lot of people don't relate to, but it makes that timeless space is interesting. And there was my father wanting to do reruns of Dad's Army, which of course we were all like, oh no, you know, we got to watch Dad's Army over and over again. And because Dad had lost his memory because he had a brain tumor, that it was even more like that, you know. But there we were in the present with him, you know, what he wanted to do. And yet there was the past laying out, you know, that his relationship to that, just that particular TV program. And the other funny moment that came to mind was when the church elder used to come by and knock on the door. And as kids, we used to run upstairs like, oh, the church elder's here. We didn't want him to talk to us. And I remember Dad, the church elder came in, Mum will have a giggle at this. And Dad was just open arms welcoming him. And we all thought, talk about personality. We thought something's really different. He was just excited to see the elder. We're like, something's wrong. So it's not really answering your question, Jackie, but I think that I hear so much regret of people who haven't dropped into the present moment with the people, you know, because we're so used to being busy, and, you know, the work of caring for somebody who's ill, you know, there's just so much to do. But it is those moments of stopping and, you know, having a laugh, or just getting right into the present time, where in a way fear doesn't exist there, because fear is so connected to the future. And grief might be present, but it comes and goes in a way, in a beautiful way, along with laughter. You know, we coexist with those feelings, don't we? Even if we're deeply sad, we have all this love and happy memories, hopefully, of that person, and, you know, how we've lived that life together. So time is a fascinating concept, you know. And I think of these young people I work with who have to face the end of their lives and leave children, and it's just an impossible thing. And yet I listen so deeply to their capacity to say, you know, this is what I'm dealing with, and I need to come into the present with this. I have to, and then I have to do right by my children as best I can, which of course is an impossible thing, but possible when you're faced with that, you know, that time is moving along towards your death way too early.
Yeah, it's very, very hard. And the other thing that did really strike me, though, that with the challenges and the difficulties, that you get a real sense of the seasons changing in Radical Acts of Love. You get a real sense, every single chapter has a different, you know, you get a sense of the time that you're in, that present moment, and what the weather's doing, what the maple tree's doing. And you also get a sense that solace and comfort has to be taken wherever you can find it, and that the natural world, the world of the trees and what's happening in the sky, is a great source of comfort. And if people can take in the world around them, they can also be helped a little bit. I mean, I remember sometimes in my life when I've gone through quite trauma, I've forgotten to notice that the blossom was on the trees, and I suddenly looked up one day and it was spring, and I thought, bloody hell, how did that happen? And I remember the year that happened to me, thinking, I'm never ever not going to notice blossom coming again. No matter what happens to me, I'm always going to try and notice the blossom. What's your relationship to nature and to helping you deal with so many different deaths and helping other people deal with what they're facing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like the connection I have with the natural world is, it seems a necessity for me. And I don't quite know how to articulate that. I mean, I know I was taught to have a love for nature, but it's become, it is like a grounding for me. And I think it is because of the cycles of life and death that are all around us in every moment. But it's also the way that I lean into difficult things. And I think there's a story in the book of Daniel, and there's a moment, and somebody brought this up recently, where I say, you know, I look for a moment, he's just about to talk about the fact that he's going to die and have to leave his girls, and I reached for the tree. In fact, you can see the tree in the right here. This is my counseling office where I work. I reach out there and it helps me just to, okay, the world's going on out there. There's some support in a certain way. I don't know how to describe that I feel from that huge big elm tree outside our front door. You know, it's like it's there. And the trees are such a symbol of, you know, they weather the storms, you know, so there's so much metaphor in nature that I bring into the book as a way, to me, of, I think, when we have to lean towards something when things are very difficult. And I think right now I'm noticing people talking, how loud the birds are singing, you know, and how the spring feels, you know, brighter and more beautiful than I've ever noticed it. Well, it probably isn't, but we're needing it to be. We're needing to notice, and we're noticing, and we're slowed down. And I think when we're slowed down, we notice things. So there's a lot of the stories. In fact, I'd like to probably write more stories about how nature comes into support. There's a story in the book about a young woman who is recovering from brain radiation secondary to, you know, breast cancer metastases, and a hummingbird builds a nest right outside her patio door where she spends every day, and the oncologist has told her it'll be at least 6 weeks. She'll just be exhausted, and even to recover enough to kind of get on with things, she the first or second day, this hummingbird started to build a nest in the black bamboo outside her studio door, and that process takes 6 weeks, actually, from the beginning of building a nest.
Wow.
And the mother hatched two
Wow.
tiny little eggs, and then she watched them hatch, and she watched them learn to fly. And talk about a distraction in nature, where she just was absolutely riveted. And you know, when you're ill, or you don't have much going on in your life, that you don't have a lot to contribute to your relationships even. But this built her relationship back, because every day her husband would come home from work. She'd been alone all day with her and her hummingbird, and she'd have things to talk to him about that were meaningful to her. And it's such a powerful story. She might not have ever noticed that nest, but because she was so down, couldn't go anywhere, then it became this beautiful relationship. She'd take pictures, she'd climb up on a stool, and then she'd email us all pictures of Wiki, she called the hummingbird. So yeah. I think it's a very powerful medicine, actually, if we're aware of it. It comes in when we need it. Mm-hmm.
It really is, and there are lots of examples like that in Radical Acts of Love. Just about, I think that's also what allows us to read the book without being scared, for those of us who might be frightened of death, because there are lots of moments, kind of epiphanies, moments of clarity, gifts really, provided to us by your watchful eye and by nature itself, and by your way of taking it in. I wonder if you could read the part in your book about the whales, just so as people can get an idea of what we're talking about there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to read that. So just to maybe set that story up a little bit, it's a story actually of a woman who had a diagnosis of a sarcoma in her leg, and the story begins where she's on the ferry from the island she lives on to see the oncologist, and she's about to get the news about whether her cancer has spread and whether she would have to have a very serious operation, which she did have to have, which was an amputation of her leg. So this is the story of that ferry journey over, and this will be about a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Rachel had slumped low in her seat on the ferry, oblivious to the presence of Michael, her husband of 25 years, beside her. She told me that she felt as though she was alone on a raft set adrift at sea, no way back to shore and no land in sight. About 15 minutes after departure, Rachel recalled being vaguely aware of hearing an announcement over the ferry's PA system. She heard Michael mutter something about a pod of orcas off the starboard bow. Rachel shook her head when he suggested she come out on deck with him. She remembered looking down at her running shoes and noticing that her laces were undone. She hadn't bothered to tie them up when she'd left the house earlier that morning. I don't want to go out in the rain. I've seen orcas before. I'll see them again, she thought. She felt unlike herself, estranged from the person who loved to kayak in the Johnston Strait and sleep outside on warm summer nights. Suddenly, a strong, invisible tug pulled Rachel up and out of her seat, a force too powerful to resist. She stepped outside into the wild and blustery early morning light. The sea was steely gray, and the almost black sky merged with the ocean at the horizon. The ship's deck glistened in the wet, and the rain pelted her uncovered head, plastering her hair to her scalp as the wind pushed open her unzipped fleece jacket. She noticed Michael and 3 other people huddled together at the furthest point forward on the starboard deck, looking out to sea. Joining them, she leaned over the deck's railing and saw the first flash of black and white as a large orca surfaced about 100 feet from the ferry. A thrill of delight coursed through her body. Soon she counted 7 or 8 orcas, surfacing and diving in and around one another, their dorsal fins pointing to the sky. A plume of spray from a blowhole shot up into the air before the orca disappeared beneath the surface of the frothy backwash. A couple of young ones mimicked their mothers, dipping and diving, and Rachel knew that this was likely a resident pod, which would include up to 4 generations. Standing on the deck in the wind and rain that day, Rachel thought it was likely just a lucky moment, seeing the orcas, but she hoped it was more than that. She wanted to believe they had come to support her, to lift her out of isolation and despair. She had read that when one orca in a pod gets sick, the others take turns supporting their ailing family member from beneath. Rachel's perspective expanded. She sensed a lineage of multiple generations of West Coast people who had lived and died along that shoreline for thousands of years. No matter how long she lived, she knew she'd always be remembered within that collective story. Whatever the surgeon would tell her later that morning, whether she would die soon or live for a long time, it didn't matter. Life was unfolding for her as it had for countless people and species throughout time. At that moment of expanded awareness, Rachel had fallen into a profound stillness. She called it grace. She told me that the peacefulness had stayed with her all the way through the meeting with Dr. Leston.
Wow, that's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. You can hear me, can't you?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Sorry, I just thought I'd kind of accidentally muted myself, which is what I'd like to do in life. Actually, just bloody mute myself. It's a great way to deal with a blather. Mute yourself. But it's a really extraordinary passage, that, and it gives you a real sense of the book, not just of its lyricism, of its kind of elegiac quality, of its moments of grace, and of that sense that death gives you if you're able to take it as you're approaching towards it, a way of putting yourself into perspective as she does there across time, and that there is a great comfort to be taken from that, to being one person at one moment in a long time. I think you've done the most remarkable thing writing this book, Janie, and I thank you, because it's been of huge help to me personally in the last few months. I'll be giving it to everybody, not just people who've recently gone through a bereavement, but anybody and everybody, because everybody can actually benefit from this book. But I'm going to stop now by thanking you very much, because we're going to take some questions now from our online audience. So thank you so much, Janie. That was really wonderful.
Thanks, Jackie.
I think that we're just waiting for the questions to come in. So I'm not sure if we're still being seen at this point or stopped. We didn't talk about that. I've
Hi,
hidden myself now.
hi,
Hi.
Jackie. Can you
Yes.
see the questions on the screen, on the chat?
Just about to. What would you like me to do? Would you like me to read them out to Janie?
Yes, please, if you could.
Okay. And when do you want me to start that, in 10 minutes or right now?
No, do it now. That's great.
Okay, so do you want me to show myself again or just to ask the questions?
Just ask the questions. It's fine.
Okay. And can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay. So there's some lovely comments here, Janie. How do you recommend we best contemplate our own death?
Oh,
That's coming, Jim Smith.
thanks, Jim, for the question. How should we contemplate our death? Well, we take people on retreats for a week to do that very thing, because I think it's not something we can do in a moment here and there, although we probably do that more often than we think. Be aware of our death and think about it. So contemplation, I think, is a very deeply personal thing, and there's many ways to do that. But I think that there's some great benefit in contemplating together with others, because then there's an open dialogue. So I think both the internal reflection on death and the external, meaning let's talk about it together. We're seeing a whole rush of opportunities to have conversations with groups of people, these death cafes, other opportunities of people wanting to get together, death book clubs and all of the rest of it. But mostly, from my perspective, it's a deeply personal relationship, and understanding really this concept of impermanence, that it really isn't something that death is not something that we can avoid, speaks the obvious, but we need to go into it and understand again what it is, what our feelings are about it. Because if we can understand our emotional relationship to death, then we're going to have more strength and courage to be able to deal with it. So contemplation is a word, of course, that belongs to many traditions. And I think of contemplation as a process that we need silence and quiet for. And then once we've kind of come into our own relationship of understanding our own relationship to death, then perhaps we can explore with other people. So it's kind of a long roundabout answer to your question, Jim, but I think it's you can start with certainly reading some pretty amazing books on the subject, but also going into your own history with death. What did you learn about death as a child? Was it scary because you were taught to be scared of it? Are you curious because you were taught to be curious about it? Understanding those beginning places, I think, brings us into, oh, that's why for me it's so terrifying, because I had an experience or I heard a story that was terrifying. So we kind of have to understand our roots to, what is it that has shaped our particular relationship with death.
I think that brings us in really nicely to Helen Bogwell's question. You talked about being courageous in our conversations with people who are dying. Please tell us more about how to do this and how to get that courage.
Well, there's some moments in the book where, even though I've worked with people for 30 years with cancer, there's a funny thing, and I don't know if it's because it's a societal taboo still to talk about death. It always feels like you have to take a risk. You almost have to so when I think of courageous conversations, like, I'm going to just open the door a little bit and just see. People say, well, how do I say to somebody that, I want to talk about my own dying or their dying? And I think we have to, the courage comes in just saying, well, what's the worst that could happen? The person says, I don't want to talk about it. Maybe that door open. And I'm always surprised by how often people actually have thought about death and dying. And I'm noticing it now with the way we talk about elders, and we're being extremely protective of elders around this in this pandemic time. And I say, well, elders, people with these, what they call comorbidities, illnesses, have thought a lot about death and dying. most people have thought a lot about it when they faced illnesses. So I think that we can be braver about stepping into a conversation and trying it out by saying, you know, I'm wondering what it's like to live with this illness. And do you find yourself thinking about death and dying? And if so, what do you think about? I mean, the curiosity, making it a question of curiosity to begin and open a conversation. I think mostly we're frightened of the emotions of it. So if again, can we take a risk, jump in and be willing to be vulnerable, which of course is a difficult thing for most of us. But we're
and often people can sorry, you know, often people can actually surprise us in those moments at having moments of humor or levity. So we might have got ourselves really psyched up for a particular part of a conversation, and it might go completely differently as conversations do. I mean, I remember when my mum was just taking in the news that my dad had died, and he died the day after her 89th birthday. So her birthday's on the 28th of October, and he died on the 29th of October. And 2 days later, she said to me, "Jackie, did I get this right? Your dad died the day after my 89th birthday." And I said, "That's right, Mum." She said, "Well, he was always lousy at birthday presents, but he's excelled himself this time." and it was exactly the opposite. And her making that little kind of joke, which was an extraordinary thing, you know, for her to be able to do, actually allowed us then to go on and have the conversation in another way, a conversation about preparing for his funeral. And it's often struck me just how much humor there often is at the end of people's lives or at funerals, as if humor allows us to survive in a different way. The next question that we've got is from Nathalie Kalinek. It says, "What would you say is most helpful during the grieving process?" So for me, that would probably be humor would be one of them, but what would it be for you, Janie?
I think that for me, it's the recognition that death's the end of a life, but it's not the end of the relationship. And so to me, it's about giving yourself permission to have an ongoing relationship with that person. And that often requires you, because you want to continue to talk about the person. So it's a funny thing we do, because we say we'll give people space and respect their grieving space. And when often it's the opposite. You want to tell funny stories. You want to tell about the life of the person. So I think the most important thing is to understand it's an ongoing relationship, and that you still want that person to be in your life in the way they can through the stories and the memories. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because I feel very sad when people say, "I can't ever talk about the person who died anymore." And I work with parents who've had children die, and they've said, the years go by and it's always difficult, and it will always be difficult till the day they die as parents. And they feel so that the griefs become so invisible, and not just the grief, but the persons become invisible in the world. And so, I feel like we walk around, I certainly do. I've had so many people through the work I do have died, and I feel their presence. And when I think of them, and I see pictures of them, it actually makes me feel better. I don't want to push them far away. I don't want them. And I think that's the biggest myth about grief, is we think we have to get over it or get past it. And all that language to me is really not really the right way to think of it, because I don't want to get past. I want to continue on with a relationship with the people I've loved, and do that by bringing them in so they're here and they're present. So I suppose to me, that's one of the saddest things. We've created this belief that we just have to get over it. And I don't think we ever do. We learn to live with grief, and we learn to live with deep sorrow in our hearts about someone who's died. But we also have, as you said, Jackie, the joy and the memories that lift us up. And we want to be able to connect with those. And it's a powerful thing to think we can be joyful in the midst of our sorrow as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is powerful to think of the relationship that you have as being part of an ongoing conversation, that the conversation doesn't stop because somebody's died. And I find that with my dad, who's such a strong presence in my life, that I can still actually hear his voice very clearly. I can ask him questions, and I can get very definite opinions back. And I feel like he's gone, but not gone that far, that far away, that he's still actually quite accessible to me. Obviously, maybe not in the way that I would want him to be, but he's accessible still. I can still make him part of my life in ways that I find a huge and continuing comfort. We've got another question here. What do you mean by leaning into difficulties? That's been asked twice, that question.
Oh, has it? It's good to think about the words that I use. And the Celts have such a good phrase, and I can't quote it, I can't get the actual source of the quote, but I've read this in many different readings about the Celtic way of life. They say, bring your pain as close to you as you can until it becomes one with you. Now, I find that really a compelling thought. So are you leaning in, or you're bringing it closer, which is the opposite in a way to what we want to do with our sorrow and our pain. We want to push it far away from us. So I suppose when I mean lean in, I mean come into a deeper closeness with your sorrow, with your life, your emotional life, because then you build confidence in it. You build confidence that you won't break if you weep. You think if I start to cry, people say this so often, if I start to cry, I'll never stop. But of course we do stop. So I think it's leaning in means lean into your sorrow or your pain to the point where it becomes familiar to you. So it's like I live alongside my sorrow. And then I think when we let it in closer, there's more space, funnily enough, for all of our emotions. I think when we push and guard and resist against feelings and push them out, then we've created a kind of constriction. So, emotion, I think of, movement. So leaning in, it's a great, I will think more about that question. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Why do I lean in, or do they lean it? Yeah. Yeah.
Lean in or hang out
Yeah, exactly.
But I remember once coming back from the Isle of Uist in the Hebrides, and I'd met these 4 women that had formed a death group there, and they were young. Quite a few of them were young, and none of them were ill, but they just knew that in order to have the kind of funeral that they might want in Uist, that they'd have to start thinking now. Otherwise, they would end up with the funeral in the one kind of parish church, and it would all be taken care of exactly the way that Highland and Island funerals can often be taken care of. And I remember coming back and saying this to my dad, that these women were in their 30s and 40s and 50s, but they formed a death group, and none of them were ill. They formed a death group, and they out of their mind. And I can still hear him saying it, because he had that kind of Scottish man's approach, or often Scottish men don't like discussing. I've noticed in particular Scottish men don't like talking about death. So here's a question here from Debbie Shan Bathurst. It said, a friend of mine's dad has a few weeks to live, and he wants to ask how he feels about dying, but he's not sure how. So thank you for the advice to be brave and allow curiosity to lead the conversation. But he's not sure how. So I think that's the main part about not being sure how. I guess that's difficult, isn't it? Because it depends very much on the person.
Well, I think you can, in a way, you can start with that, and I sometimes start with that. I really want to be able to have a conversation with you about death and dying, or where you are in this disease, and I don't really know how to have the conversation with you. Like, it's sort of, in other words, just show up with the feelings of that difficulty, and I think people then take pity on you. It's like, well, I'm up for having it. I mean, I think people are more up for it than you think. And I think we're afraid to approach people who are ill. And, because this is the work that I do, I often say, is this something you're open to talking about? Because I would like to. So it's kind of almost giving permission so they can enter in or not, rather than expect them to. Because I think the time and place for these conversations are very personal, aren't they? You don't want to. Sometimes, parents talk about that with their kids. It's in the car where you're not looking at each other that these deep conversations happen. So you like to be able to give people an opportunity to say, no, this is not a good time to talk about it, but I'd like to talk about it another time. So in a way, just saying, you know, there's something I'm wondering if you're open to talking about, you know, what end of life might feel like for you, or do you think about it, or do you only think about hope? We're very afraid that if we open the conversation up, there's the signal is we're giving up hope on you. And I think that's a very confusing thing, this issue of hope. So I say things to people like, you know, I will let you define hope for me. You know, hope is what you tell me you want it to be, and I will stand with you in that hope. And there's a lot of fear, I think, especially in the professional world, that that's somehow giving false hope. But it doesn't give a lot of respect to the person that actually knows that hope is a part of life. And to be able to be hopeful about today doesn't mean they're ignoring or denying death. So I think this conversation about, you know, can we have hopeful conversations, and meanwhile, can we also have the other conversations that when it seems like things are not going to go the way we hope they will go, so that's the kind of language that then we can talk about the harder conversations about you not being here and what your wishes are and how you want that to go. And I sometimes make that comparison to birth, that, you know, we wouldn't wait till we're in labor till we go and figure out where we're going to have the baby and who's going to help us, you know. But in death, we kind of think, well, we'll just kind of deal with it when it happens. And that seems to me not a very useful way to think of it, because that's the preparation that, you know, comes through the stories of many of these stories in the book, that, you know, it is worth thinking about that. So even if you focus a conversation more on the practical side of things, you know, would you want to be, have you thought about being at home, or would you want to be in hospital or hospice? Like, that's a kind of a bit of an easier conversation than, are you afraid, or what are you afraid of? And is there some way I can help with that? So you can start kind of on a more tangible line. And I think that some people say, oh, I've never even thought about that. Where would I want to be? And that's a useful entry in sometimes.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, Jenny, probably two more. This one's from Pauline Lord. If you don't have a religious belief to help you through grief, as a lot of people turn to religion, what else can fill that gap? Is it community? Is it nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's people are certainly, some people are very helped by their faith traditions, and, you know, and then often people ask that question, well, what if I don't have that? Is that but I think we do have again, what anchors us, you know, what brings our steadiness in our life, not even in our death, to think about what helps you right now to be steady, what helps you not escalate your fear, what helps you to feel safe right now. And I mean, I think it's often people often, but some people don't have family. And I think about, well, the caregivers, you know, again, they can be such a help. So I think faith, again, there are many people who don't have a religious or even a spiritual faith. So what is it that supports us? Well, I think we have to look at our lives, and some people get so helped by creative process, by art and music, and, you know, and animals. And, you know, so again, what helps us to feel safe and secure, and what helps us to feel we can manage our lives right now. And those are the things I think that people turn to. And sometimes their family, friends, sometimes that's difficult and complex. It's not the place they feel. Some people really feel supported by strangers. I always find that amazing, that people can enter your life near the end of your life and they become the people that you rely on. So it's not always what we expect, and to be open to thinking about, okay, what gives me, I get a lot of comfort from poetry and reading, you know, and reading literature and books I go back to, and I think, that's a help to me. So, you know,
it's good that you should say that about books, because one of the other questions was actually about books and asking you what books do you turn to, and what books can help you? What books would you recommend perhaps people read? I'm trying to find the exact question. Yes, here we are. It's from Emily Chappell. What other books would you recommend to help us come to terms with our own deaths and those of our loved ones? Which books would you recommend?
I'd recommend Emily Chappell's new book. So I know Emily. Hi, Emily. It's a great question. I'm glad we do have lots of books that help us. It depends kind of on our sensibility. I mean, there's the books of kind of the faith and spiritual traditions, many books on death and dying. I certainly have read every one of those books I can find, because I want to understand the principles of how, I don't belong to any of those traditions, but I'm interested in them. So, again, the Buddhist traditions, the mystical Christian, all of those books interest me. I find I'm very interested in books of, again, poetry that sort of speaks to, in a way, how we can enter into the intimacy of our own lives and have a larger view at the same time. I think of poetry of Mary Oliver, of course, because of my love of nature, but she does that so beautifully, where she enters into the intimacy of a moment, and then she does this beautiful kind of, and brings in these universal principles. So poetry is hugely helpful for me. And I was going to ask Jackie to read a poem, just because she's a poet who I love and respect. And I don't know, can you throw a poem in here, Jackie? I'll
read a poem called Darling, actually. And this is about my dear friend Julia Darling, who died many years ago now, but who I keep very, very close. And she was a writer and a poet herself. And if you want to look her up, Julia Darling, her poetry that she wrote as she was dying, as she was ill, is kind of uplifting, surprisingly humorous in places, and really, really well worth checking out. So this is called Darling. You might forget the exact sound of her voice, or how her face looked when sleeping. You might forget her quiet weeping, curled into the shape of a half moon, when smaller than herself, she seemed already to be leaving before she left, when the blossom was on the trees and the sun was out and all seemed good in the world. I held her hand and sang a song from when I was a girl. He-oh-ya-ho, boys, let her go, boys. And when I stopped singing, she had slipped away, already a slip of a girl again, skipping off, her heart light, her face almost smiling. And what I didn't know or couldn't say then was that she hadn't really gone. The dead don't go till you do, loved ones. The dead are still here, holding our hands.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jack.
That's it. Thank you for asking me. So I'm just going to, I think, say your book, Jenny, is available at the Also Bookshop, of course, and you can get onto that by the website, which you should be on at the moment anyway, all those people that are out there watching. But for those people that come across this program in some other way, it's www.alsofestival.com/books. So I think I'll just end up with a question from you, myself, Jenny, because I think I've asked you as many of the questions as we've got time for. I just want to ask you how you're feeling at the moment. I know that you're in Vancouver at the moment, and your mum's in Glasgow, and there's so much uncertainty in our world. And you've had a book come out into this pandemic. How are you feeling, and what are your hopes for your future?
Thanks, Jackie. Such a touching question. There's just so much for all of us. There's so many layers, and there's so many layers for me too. And I feel that I'm one of the lucky ones, that I have food to eat. I have work, I have a home, I have shelter, I have a lot of love and community. So For my life, I feel that, is it Bernard Shaw that said, I want to be all used up when I die? It's kind of been a bit of a mantra for me, because if I can, I want to be of use and be of service. And that maybe sounds mighty. It's not meant to sound that way. I think that when we have an opportunity to, because of our privilege and our, our luck, so to speak, that, I really want to try and make a difference. And each day, these days where I'm around families where they have a loved one who's in hospice or palliative care, and they can't have their communities with them. They can't have their friends. We've got a couple of young people right now in that position, and their friends are everything to them, and they're not allowed to have friends. So I'm engaged, and I'm happy to be in creative ways that we can be there for people when we can't be there in presence, in form. So I just spent 2 days working on a video collection where over 20 friends gave a beautiful tribute to this young man who's really at the very end of his life. And his wife said, well, he can't really see. So I thought, well, he can hear. And so these 20 brave young people, all living, most of them living with cancer themselves, wrote, I said, okay, 20 to 30 seconds video clip. Of course, most of them are about 45, but to give a tribute to this young man who's about to leave this world, and to do this beautiful collection to music, some music that he loved. He was actually a DJ. He's only in his 30s. He's as a young child, and I was talk about courage. I thought, this is amazing. People could actually say something to him before he's died. So. And we did another one where we did these, put photographs of friends onto fabric, and we made 2 strings of prayer flags to go in her hospital room with faces of people, smiling at her, because people who couldn't visit her. So I think the creative process, if we, rather than focusing on what I can't do, and there's many things I wish I could do, I'd like to kind of just blast through those rules at times and say, I'm coming to see you, but I can't. I have to respect why we're doing that. We're trying to take care of everybody. That the creative process is what makes me feel enlivened in this terribly difficult time like that. How do we work as a community now with all the limitations that have been put on us, and what can we do as opposed to what we can't do right now? And I mean, I just spent 2 days in such a wonderful conversation with all these friends who said, I want to participate in this video, or it was actually audio video. And it's got sent to his hospital room yesterday, and his wife let him hear it. And, I just think, well, that feels like something, important when we can't go with ourselves to visit somebody and speak to them in real time. We can do things like that. So I don't know if I answered your question. My future, I think I'll just keep doing that. I'll just keep trying to. Yeah.
I think you answered not just my question, but another question that we had coming in there towards the end, which was actually about coping with bereavement and with pre-grief, if you like, with people dying in these particular times when you can't go and visit somebody, when you can't have gatherings at a funeral, when you're having to leave your last message on half a face on an iPad. When we're confronted with these kind of challenges. And I think your point about that we need to focus on what we can do and not what we can't do is incredibly wise. Wise advice, and it reminds me that that apart from anything else, this really wonderful book, Radical Acts of Love, is full of pearls of wisdom. Really, it gives you practical advice about how to approach things from all sorts of different things. And you're telling me of this young man who's a DJ now. I mean, it's very, very touching. We often are frightened of death because we feel that somebody's going to be terribly, terribly alone. And one of our biggest fears is the idea that somebody would die on their own, alone, and even worse, maybe not being discovered for days. These are the kind of things that nightmares are made of. And I think, if we can and we're able to find creative and different ways of accompanying people at that moment when they cross over, if you like, then we're doing something. And I think that your book really, really helps with that. But it doesn't give us platitudes. It doesn't gloss over things. It's not full of cliches, and it's not full of step-by-step stages, like, say, a book that I read years ago, which was valuable then, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on Death and Dying, which is a kind of seminal book, and it told you about the various different stages of grief, denial, acceptance, and all the rest of it. When you don't do that in this book in that way, what you do, which is so refreshing, is that it doesn't feel like it's kind of full of kind of death speak or new age language about grief that is off-putting, but it's full of a beautiful language that we can all access and understand, and that is of great help to us all. So I think, you know, as a nurse and as a counsellor over these 30 years of your life and these last 8 years of writing this book, that I would like to say a huge thank you for writing the book and for putting it out into the world and for giving it to me and to so many other people that are going to get so much solace, comfort, inspiration, and dare I say, joy from this book. I've got joy from speaking to you just now, Janie. It's been lovely to catch up with you in this way. I wish we'd been able to meet in person, but there's always something special about adapting, as you said. You talked about adapting a lot, and we've adapted by being in this Zoom room together, and the Zoom room is possibly more intimate than you could possibly imagine. So thank you very much, Janie Brown. Thank you to the festival for hosting us, and see you soon, I hope.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks, Jackie. It's been amazing. Yeah.